the wonderful thing about historical fiction, and at least the way that I approach it, is I tried very hard not to get into exposition where you're just saying, oh, remember this and this and this that happened on these years. People don't talk that way.
Right.
We don't sit around and go, well, you remember what happened in 2011 and then 2012 and no. We talk about, you remember this thing happened and then this thing happened next and that affected us this way. So my characters refer to things that happened, for us historically. That's their own personal history, their own personal past that has affected them in one way or another. In the siege, I have a soldier, an old soldier, who talks about his experience under Colonel Washington during the French and Indian War, talking about how Washington's his reputation was sort of cemented by his actions in the French and Indian War, which, by the way, Washington accidentally started that war. I don't know if you're aware.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's actually interesting. As we've been sitting here talking, I've been thinking back into my family history. I don't remember when it was. It might have been related to the French and Indian War, but I can't say for sure. I'm really bad with genealogy and family history. That my mom is into that, and other members of the family, but it's not my strong suit, not my interest. But I know I actually had an ancestor that tried to assassinate George Washington at one point.
Oh, wow.
So I think it might have been during the French and Indian War.
Okay, I was going to say that would be unusual for him to be a target of assassination at that time. Obviously, once he became president, you get into some of the resentment that happened in the early republic against the taxes, the Whiskey Rebellion, and so forth. There was a lot more folks who were targeting Washington at that point.
Yeah, I want to say that it was. I feel certain it was before the Revolution. Okay. So that's why I'm saying it might have been the French and Indian War. I want to say it might have been related to a dispute when he was a surveyor as well.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that history. So.
Oh, I didn't expect you would
study. But yeah, I mean, and getting to bring in some of these stories that sort of set the stage and explain why was Washington held in such high regard. Well, there was good reason for it. He was appointed leader of the Continental Army for really good reasons. It wasn't just because he was tall, and it wasn't just because he, sat astride a white horse or whatever. It was because he was a magnificent leader, and that was remembered from the French and Indian War when he was fighting for the British, of course. Mm-hmm. It's getting to bring that information in through the personal stories of my characters helps to make it more real. The reason that I sat down and started writing historical fiction was because I was a reader of historical fiction.
Okay.
Like most people, I disliked reading history because it's boring. It's this date, this number of people did this thing in this place. Now on this next date, these people did this thing on this place. Who cares? Tell me the stories. Tell me the stories of those people. Why did they do those things? Why did it matter to them so much that they were willing to put their lives on the line? Why did it matter to them so much that they were willing to leave everything that they loved behind? That's to me what's important about history. You will very rarely find a date of any kind in any of my books because it's not the way that we experience our own lives, our own history. We don't sit down and say, well, on September 12th, 1922, my grandmother was, no, who cares? Now, September 12th, 2001, yes, we're going to remember that, or some of it. But, just like when somebody first heard the Declaration of Independence being read, they would remember that. When the bell rings in the center of the town square and there's a guy standing on the courtyard, on the court steps, shouting out this declaration of, oh my gosh, we've actually we've done it. We've declared independence from Britain. That's a memorable event. So that makes it into my books. The exact date on which that happened, not so important.
Yeah. So how do you develop your characters? I mean, obviously you're working with a historical background, and doing a lot of research, because I know you want to make things historically accurate. So how do you go about meshing, creating the characters and meshing that with the real history?
As I said, I've read a lot of journals and personal letters and so forth of people who lived at that time, to try to develop an understanding of how they saw the world, and then I try to reflect that in how they behave in the pages of my books. I'm also a lifelong student of just human nature, observing how people develop the beliefs that they act upon and that they are willing to stake their lives on. So that's something that I bring into my books. And it's going to sound a little bit schizophrenic, but when I am writing, there comes a point in the story where the characters simply take over. And at that point, what's left for me to do as an author is to hang on tight and write down what they do. And I very often have the experience of having a character who does something that I didn't expect and I didn't intend for them to do, and it winds up changing the story for the better. Once I can start telling that character story, I almost don't have any work left to do. I just write it down.
I've heard other authors say something similar, so that doesn't sound crazy to me at all.
Well, authors are a we're not any kind of magical being, but we are certainly a little bit odd.
True.
That's been my experience of most of the authors I've known, is that we're all a little bit of an odd crew. The thing that what I also sometimes do, though, is I do find, I had a character in my very first book that I wrote, who was a wonderful character. It wasn't somebody I had really intended to focus on. He was an historical figure, a very minor historical figure, but he was an historical figure. So I had a name, I had some background on him, and he made his way onto the stage in the book. And then he kind of shouldered his way to the front of the stage and said, "No, you're going to tell some of my story." And he was a great character. I loved him. And then I started writing another book, The Wind, actually. And there was a character in that one who started behaving the same way. And it turned out to be very much, he had a lot of the same sort of attitudes and so forth. So I killed him. Because I said, I'm not gonna just tell the same story over and over again. So I killed him. And what was interesting was that the act of his murder changed the entire arc of that story. It changed the way that story unfolded in some really wonderful and powerful ways. And that wouldn't have happened without my interfering in the character's, decisions and so forth. But what it did do was it highlighted that sort of tension between letting the characters do what they want and then reaching in as an author and making them dance. But once I killed him, I let the rest of my characters react and respond to that according to what was natural for them.
Uh-huh. That makes a lot of sense. I haven't had anything published yet, but I am a writer. Hope to do some publishing here in the next little while, and I study the craft a little bit, and that all makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, so. I try very hard not to study craft, and this is going to sound conceited, but I'm going to say it anyway. I sit down and I write, mm-hmm. and I am terrified that if I study what I'm doing, I'm going to lose that magic where I just sit down and I write, because I'm going to get stuck thinking about how I'm writing and how to craft it and how to do the 3-act blah blah blah. No, just let me sit down and write. Let my characters do their thing, and I'll write it down. You know, there are two major schools of thought in how you approach writing. One is you plot everything out and then you just write it down. The other is you're a discovery writer. You set your characters in motion and you discover what they're going to do. And I'm very much the discovery writer. I'm very much, you know, writing into the dark, as some people call it, or pantsing.
Yep.
Writing by the seats of my pants. That's very much my style. I did try to sit down and plot out a book one time. That was The Freedman. So I write during National Novel Writing Month. So 30 days, November, I sit down November for actually the night of Halloween at midnight, I sit down and I start writing. And so my agreement with my wife is that she is a widow once a month, one time a year, 1 month out of the year, because when I'm writing, you know, this year wasn't too bad, but most years, you know, when I'm writing, you know, I finish up cooking dinner and getting everybody off to bed, and then I sit down and I write, and I might be up till 2 or 3 in the morning. So I'm not good for anything else that entire month. My employer is very patient with me in November. You know, my day job, very patient with me in November, but you know, I do my best to give them good value. But once I'm done doing that, I'm not good for anything else. So November, my wife's a widow, and she kind of accepts that. I came across this story that was just absolutely compelling to me a few years ago at the beginning of the year. And I said, you know, what I came across was a news story about the former mayor of Greenville, North Carolina, who was doing some genealogy and discovered that he had an ancestor who had fought in the Revolution for the Americans as a former slave. And I said, holy cow, that's a story I've got to tell. So I said, okay, I'm on fire for this right now. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write down. I'm going to write down the plot of this story. 3 chapters later, I realized that I was in deep trouble with my wife, and I ended up writing The Freedman during the course of that year instead of in the course of November. So that one was kind of out of band. I wasn't really supposed to be writing that one. I think in many ways, it's one of my finest books. It was a complete failure at plotting because once the characters started speaking to me, which they did basically on page 1, I had a story and I had to tell it. And what was really interesting about that, you know, after I published it, I was doing some publicity for it, and I had somebody make a comment that, you know, I had no business telling this story. It's not my story to tell. And what was really interesting was, as I was doing my genealogy, I discovered that I actually had an ancestor. You know, I did one of these genetic tests, DNA tests things, and I had found that I had an ancestor who had come from Haiti in about 1780 or so, and the DNA showed that ancestor probably originated in West Africa. So despite the pallor of my skin, it turns out that it probably was, at least in part, my story to tell. You know, my other answer to that is that these stories have been sitting around for 200 plus years and nobody's told them yet. Better that somebody tell them, even if it's an imperfect telling, even if it doesn't have all of the understanding and background. Better that somebody tell one of those stories and encourages others to tell the story too. I mean, if somebody else wants to write, there were, I think, 40,000 free black men or free black people in the United States at the time of the Revolution. That's 40,000 stories, friends.
Absolutely.
Let's tell some more of them. There are a lot of them to tell, and I will boost the living hell out of those because I want to read those stories. I want to hear those stories. I want to hear the stories of all of these people There were about 3.5 million people in what is now the United States at the time of the Revolution, all told. And there are a lot of just fantastic stories to tell there. And very, very few of those stories made it into the history books, and every one of them is worth hearing.
Absolutely. So yeah, you answered a couple more of my questions there. I was going to ask how you do everything, because there are so many things that you do that you enjoy, from the clockmaking or restoring and fiddling, so many different things. I was wondering how you fit it all in. So NaNoWriMo as your focus for when you do your writing, that totally makes sense.
Yep.
But I also understand, and I write poetry as well as prose. So maybe I'm going to use terminology a little bit differently than you do. But for me, when my muse visits, when my muse strikes, that's when I need to do my writing. And that's when it's some of the best writing that I do. So I understand you can't always schedule that.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, because I do write within the constraints of the National Novel Writing Month, I do kind of have to schedule it. So, some nights I come up here, and those are the nights that I sit up here until 3 in.the morning because the muse isn't coming, and I've still got to get my words in. So, the thing that they say, as in encouraging people in the National Novel Writing Month, is that you cannot edit a blank page. So if I write 1,700 crappy words in a night, I can edit those. I cannot edit the blank page that those words occupy. So I would much rather sit down and write, the 1,700 words or 2,000 words in a night and have to go back and rework them heavily than not write.
Absolutely.
And the other thing is that a lot of writers say that they have to write every day, or they get mentally constipated or whatever. And I don't have that experience, because I've done this for 13 years, where I sit down, Halloween night and I start writing. And so that's kind of my comfortable cycle. And the rest of the year I spend on editing and marketing and doing all of the business side. And there are times when I sit down and I get a wild hair and I just start writing. I have a couple of books that I've written, or a couple novellas that I've written under a pen name that I won't reveal, because they are a completely separate project.
Sure.
They are I'll just call it Gonzo science fiction, and it's very much off-brand for my historical fiction. Where with my historical fiction, I really strive to get absolutely everything right that I possibly can. With the Gonzo sci-fi, I'm just like, I don't care. I'll get the parts right that I know about, and because I do have a fairly broad base of knowledge, I do get a lot right. But there's stuff where I just go, no, I'm making that up. I don't care if it violates the laws of physics. I'm making it up.
Well, I imagine that I would guess in a way a good release for you, maybe even cathartic. It's activating and using maybe a different part of your brain and of your creativity than you use for your regular writing. Yep. So I think that's probably beneficial for you.
Yep. My one rule on writing those is I do absolutely no research. I actually literally write them. I participate in the Oregon Star Party, which is a major gathering of astronomers up in Central Oregon. And it is as off-grid as you can get. It's out in the middle of the Ochako National Forest. You literally, I cannot get any kind of connectivity out there at all. There are a few people who've gone to extraordinary measures and have a little bit of, they can get a message out if they need to. But I sit up there with absolutely no access to the internet. All I have is the contents of my head and maybe a couple of friends around me. And I sit down and I write. And so I'm literally sitting at a card table in the back of a U-Haul trailer, writing my heart out, a few thousand words a day. And at the end of the week, I've got a novella that is just a good romp. It's a completely unhinged romp in science fiction.
That's neat. I have a few other friends that go to the Oregon Star Party. I hear it is a really good time.
Oh, it's amazing. The reason that we do it in the location, and I also serve on the board there, so I know a fair amount about it, and I've been going for over 20 years now. But the reason we do it where we do it is because if you look at a satellite image of the United States taken at night, you'll notice that almost the entire country is covered in light from cities. One of the very darkest places on that satellite image is in Eastern Oregon and Central Oregon. And so when you get out there, you can literally walk by the light of the Milky Way. Once your eyes get adapted to the darkness, the Milky Way is enough light for you to be able to see the road and walk up and down at night. And that is an experience that just never fails to absolutely blow my mind. I'm a fairly advanced amateur astronomer. I've got a number of telescopes, rather too many. I go up there and I'm able to see stuff up there that I never see anywhere else. I'm able to get at dim objects in the sky that you can't see otherwise. And the stuff that's bright is easier and clearer to see. You point your telescope at something like Jupiter or Mars, and it feels like you're shining a laser out through the back of your skull when you look into the eyepiece because it's so bright. And we do it at new moon, so we have as little moon as possible. But once you do get a little sliver of the moon, that's basically going to be the last thing you're going to look at that night, because your night vision is going to be completely destroyed.
Yeah, I've never been to the Oregon Star Party, but I've been out to Eastern Oregon a few times for rafting and camping and things like that, and it is absolutely beautiful. And I think that people who don't experience the nighttime sky without all the light pollution that we have in the cities and things, they're missing out.
Oh yeah. I mean, just with the naked eye, sitting in a chair, looking up at the sky there in Ochoco National Forest, you can get a sense of, again, this goes back to my interest in history and my interest in human experience across history. You can get a sense of what our far distant ancestors saw, as they rested from the day's work and looked up at the sky. And you can get a sense of why people developed a lot of beliefs about the sky, because it is so magnificent to see, and it is so inexplicable to a mind that hasn't been exposed to all of our modern understanding. And that's not to say that we understand everything at all. There are many, many, many great questions still to be answered. Yeah. And we live in an era where not only do we have access to all of this information, but there's new information being generated at a rate that we cannot possibly keep up with, and that is amazing. And people talk about historical historical figures being wealthy. And how fortunate they were, and so forth. And you talk about richest Croesus and so forth. Croesus didn't have access to the total sum of human knowledge at his fingertips. He only knew what he could learn from the few people that he had around him, and perhaps a few books. And anybody who has a smartphone has access to the sum total of human knowledge. And the fact that we live in a time when that is possible, not only possible, but every day, is to me that we are wealthy. We're literally wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice of the people who came before us. I think about somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who amassed the largest library in America, and I think he would have been blown away by the opportunity to literally pull a device out of his pocket and ask it any question that he had and get a reasonably good answer back. And if he didn't believe that answer, he could research it and look into why did it give me that answer and where did that information come from, and get down to the primary sources, the people who actually looked at this stuff and learned it and how they learned it, and can I reproduce that? And the fact that we are awash in so much information, so much good information. Yes, there's a lot of bad information out there. I absolutely agree with that. But that's where we have to learn how to be critical thinkers and to not just accept things at face value, but actually dig down to our primary sources and learn how to evaluate the credentials of those primary sources and the believability of those primary sources, the motivations of those primary sources. If I read a scientist is looking at we've got a thing in the news right now. They've found a signal from Proxima Centauri that they think, it looks like if it's actually from Proxima Centauri, it's very likely of intelligent origin. Actually, what I saw somebody say was, it's definitely of intelligent origin. The question is it Proxima Centauri or is it here? So
yeah, that makes
looking
sense.
at that, we can say, okay, well, let me see the research paper. Well, that's available. We can look up that paper. We can read what they found. We can read their reasoning. When we had this recent news about the gases that were found in the atmosphere of Venus, I went and I downloaded that paper and I read it. And some of it's thick, some of it's not easy to read.
Sure. But
you can download it and read it. And if you don't understand something, you can go look it up and learn about it. Being able to get at those primary sources and then look at, okay, why did these people pursue this line of research? What motivated them? Was it because they believed something and they wanted to prove it? Or was it because they were asking questions and they came across this interesting piece of data and then tried to understand what that data meant? And if you can, once you get down to that question, then you can start to assess how believable that is. If I'm reading something written by somebody who's been talking about aliens for his entire career with no proof, and then all of a sudden he has this paper that says, oh, I've proved it, I'm going to be a lot more skeptical of his work than I am of the guy or gal who says, I found this really strange thing and I can't explain it. One possible explanation is, some sort of extraterrestrial life form. Mm-hmm. I'm ruling out every other possible explanation. This is what I'm coming up with. That to me is more rigorous and believable. And that skill of learning how to assess the credibility of information, I think that's probably the most critical skill for anybody to learn in this age of just information from, again, the sum total of human experience and knowledge. Being able to figure out what parts of that information are useful and believable is that to me is, there is no more important skill.
How do we teach that? Because a lot of people don't have that.
That's skill. A great question.
We see that all the time on
yeah, that's a terrific question. And I don't know that I have an instant answer. I would have to really think about that a lot. And I think a lot of people are trying to approach that question and trying to understand how we solve that problem. Because obviously we're seeing that play out in many ways today. Everything from how do we respond to a global pandemic to who do we believe in a news story. Mm-hmm. That stuff is it has real world consequences. It has very real costs if we get it wrong, and it has very real benefits if we get it right. So I think it's really important to develop that skill, and I don't have an answer for you as to how we develop it, unfortunately.
Okay. No problem. So one thing that I really appreciate that you've done, and I can tell that education is something that's really important to you, from our discussion that we've had so far today, as well as just browsing your website. One thing I really appreciate that you've done is you've actually gone through and written up um, like discussion guides for educational use for those who are, teachers or homeschooling, for them to be able to use and use with their students.
Yep.
So I imagine that
Um,
took some work for you to do.
yeah, one thing that I do offer with every single one of my books is, if you are an educator of any kind, and you want to assess the use of my books in education, drop me a line and I'll get you one. I'll send you a copy. And I would prefer that it be an electronic copy, just because that doesn't cost me as much. But
Sure.
if you're an educator and you really are interested in looking at how these books can help educate kids into our national origins, then I absolutely want you to have a copy of as many of them as you want, so that you can assess them. And writing those discussion guides, I'm not a huge fan of reading literature and then writing a book report. I think that's yes, it can help you understand what's happening in a book, but it's also taking some of the joy out of it. But I also recognize that putting things in context is critical to understanding, what happened in a book. So, when you read about the Siege of Yorktown, um, understanding the context that is outside the scope of that book, outside the scope of that novel or the history that you're reading, is really important. So that's where those discussion guides and discussion questions are designed to help branch out beyond what's just in the pages of the book, to encourage people. I've had a number of people who've read my books and have said, I never really looked into this before, but now I'm going and I'm researching it and I'm learning about it, and I wouldn't have done that if I hadn't read this book. And that's what I'm after.
I imagine that's really gratifying.
I love, yeah, I love having somebody say, I was never really interested in this before I read your book, and now I'm fascinated. Mission accomplished. I'm done.
Totally. So I should have done this at the beginning, but let's do it now, and we'll do it again at the end if I remember. I apologize if I don't, because my memory is horrible. But if someone does want to know more about your books or get in touch with you, how do they do that?
So the best place to do that is my website, which is just LarsDHHedbor.com, and that's Lars DH Hedbor, just like you see on my book title there, on my book cover. So there's no A in my last name. A lot of people want to put an A or two in there, and there just isn't one. But that's the best place to reach me. I'm also very active on Facebook. I have an active author page on Facebook. And then on Twitter, I have a daily tweet about what happened on this date in the American Revolution. And so I tweet that a few times a day, most days. So I try to provide a little bit of value there without having too much in the way of sales on Twitter. But if you want to reach out to me on Twitter, I'm there also.
Okay, great.
But yeah, those are the best places to reach me. And of course, you can find my books, at Amazon and on BarnesandNoble.com and so forth. I also do sell my books directly. And if somebody is really wanting to make sure that I make as much money as possible from my books, which of course is in my interest also, buying them from me directly is the best way to do that. And if you're buying physical books, I can also make sure that I get that signed for you.